Think you understand suffering? The Chinese imperial concubines of the 19th century would laugh at your problems, except they couldn't laugh. They could barely walk. What they endured daily would make modern torture look like a spa treatment. These women lived in a world where beauty meant breaking bones, where love meant lifelong agony, and where imperial favor came at the cost of your feet. Picture this. You're 4 years old, maybe 5 if you're lucky. Your mother sits you down with tears in her eyes, not because she wants to hurt you, but because she knows what happens to girls who don't go through this process. No marriage, no future, no worth in society. She takes your tiny feet in her hands and begins to fold your toes under your sole, wrapping them so tightly that the bones snap like twigs. You scream until your voice gives out. But this is only day 1. This torture will continue for years until your feet are permanently deformed into what society calls beautiful. This was foot binding, and by the 19th century, it had reached its absolute peak. Nearly half of all Chinese women had bound feet. But among the upper classes, among the women destined for the imperial harem, the number was almost 100%. Every single one of them had endured this childhood nightmare in the hopes of catching an emperor's eye. The Qing Dynasty imperial court wasn't just collecting beautiful women. They were collecting broken women, women whose very ability to walk had been sacrificed on the altar of male desire. These concubines represented the ultimate intersection of beauty, pain, and power in one of history's most brutal social systems. But here's what's truly shocking. The emperors who demanded these broken beauties were the same rulers who repeatedly tried to ban foot binding. The Manchu conquerors who established the Qing Dynasty found this Chinese practice so horrific, they issued edict after edict trying to stop it. Yet their own harems were filled with women who bore the permanent scars of this torture. How did this contradiction exist? How did a practice so painful persist for over 1,000 years? And what was life really like for the women trapped between imperial desire and cultural expectation? The answers lie in understanding one of history's most twisted beauty standards, where a 3-inch foot was worth more than a woman's ability to run, dance, or even walk normally, where mothers became torturers to save their daughters from social death, where palace walls contained not just the empire's most pampered women, but some of its most physically damaged. Welcome to the dark reality of the Qing Dynasty imperial harem, where beauty was measured in broken bones and imperial favor came wrapped in silk bandages soaked in blood. Let's start with the process itself, because understanding the horror requires knowing exactly what these 4- and 5-year-old girls endured. The foot-binding ritual typically began in winter, when cold would numb the pain slightly. Mothers, grandmothers, or professional footbinders would soak the child's feet in warm water mixed with herbs and animal blood. This wasn't for mystical reasons. This was purely practical, softening the skin and bones for what came next. The process was systematic torture disguised as beauty preparation. First, the toenails were cut as short as possible to prevent them from growing into the flesh. Then came the breaking. The 4 smaller toes were bent with tremendous force underneath the sole of the foot. Not gently guided, not gradually positioned, but violently folded until the bones cracked audibly. The child's screams could be heard throughout the house. But the breaking was just the beginning. Long strips of cloth, usually silk for wealthy families, were wound around the foot with incredible tightness. The goal was to cut off circulation, to force the broken bones to heal in their new, unnatural position. The bindings were wrapped so tight that the foot would turn purple, then blue, then an alarming grayish color as blood flow stopped. Every few days, the bindings were unwrapped, the rotting flesh cleaned away, and fresh bandages applied even tighter than before. Infection was almost guaranteed. The smell was described by European missionaries as unbearable, a combination of rotting flesh, pus, and the herbs used to prevent gangrene. Many girls lost toes to infection. Some lost entire feet. A few died from blood poisoning. The pain was constant and excruciating. Girls couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything except the burning agony radiating from their feet. They developed fevers from the trauma and infection. Their personalities changed as chronic pain rewired their developing brains. Happy, playful children became withdrawn and listless. This torture continued for years. The foot was gradually compressed and reshaped until it measured no more than 3 to 4 inches from heel to toe. The arch was broken and folded in half. The toes, except for the big toe, were tucked completely underneath and often rotted away entirely. The heel and front of the foot were forced together until they nearly touched. What emerged from this years-long process wasn't a foot anymore. It was a grotesque triangle of flesh and broken bone that could barely support a woman's weight. The Golden Lotus, as a 3-inch foot was called, represented the pinnacle of Chinese feminine beauty. But calling it beautiful was like calling a broken vase an art piece because you liked the jagged edges. The immediate physical consequences were devastating, but the long-term effects were even worse. Women with bound feet couldn't run. They could barely walk. Their entire gait changed as they learned to balance on what were essentially stumps. They developed massive thigh and buttock muscles from compensating for their destroyed feet. Their spines curved unnaturally from the altered way they had to carry their weight. But perhaps most importantly for our story, they couldn't escape. A woman with bound feet was physically trapped wherever she was placed. She couldn't flee an abusive husband, couldn't run from attackers, couldn't even leave her home without assistance. In a society where women already had limited rights, foot binding removed their last option, the ability to simply walk away. This was the reality that awaited girls born into families wealthy enough to consider sending a daughter to the imperial court. The irony is staggering when you consider that the Qing Dynasty was ruled by Manchus, a people from the northern steppes where women rode horses and needed functional feet for survival. When the Manchus conquered China in 1644, they were horrified by foot binding. Their own women were warriors and riders who would have laughed at the idea of deliberately crippling themselves for beauty. The very first Qing emperor immediately issued an edict banning foot binding throughout the empire. He followed it up with additional bans in 1638 and 1664. The penalties for continuing the practice were severe, but the Chinese population simply ignored these edicts. Foot binding was so deeply embedded in Han Chinese culture that mothers continued breaking their daughters' feet despite imperial prohibition. Local officials, who were mostly Han Chinese themselves, refused to enforce the bans. The practice was too connected to marriageability, social status, and economic survival for families to abandon it, simply because foreign conquerors found it distasteful. By 1668, the Kangxi emperor was forced to admit defeat. He formally withdrew the ban on foot binding, recognizing that the practice was so entrenched that attempting to eliminate it was destabilizing his rule. This created one of history's most bizarre contradictions, an empire where the ruling dynasty officially opposed a practice that was required for entry into their own imperial harem. The selection process for imperial concubines during the Qing Dynasty was elaborate and systematic, designed to identify the most beautiful and suitable women from among the 8 banner families, the elite Manchu and Mongolian clans that formed the backbone of Qing power. Every 3 years, the Imperial Board of Revenue would compile lists of eligible candidates, girls typically aged 14 to 16, for presentation at the Forbidden City. But here's where the contradiction becomes stark. While Manchu girls were forbidden from binding their feet, Han Chinese women were expected to have bound feet to be considered beautiful enough for imperial attention. This meant that the harem contained 2 distinct types of women, physically differentiated by their feet. Manchu concubines could walk normally, could travel, could even ride horses. Han Chinese concubines hobbled on their mutilated stumps, completely dependent on servants for basic mobility. The selection day itself was a spectacle of both beauty and disability. Hundreds of young women would arrive at the Shenwu gate of the Forbidden City, accompanied by their families and local officials. The Manchu girls walked confidently, their natural gait displaying health and vitality. The Han Chinese candidates were often carried in sedan chairs or supported by servants, their bound feet making the journey to the palace an ordeal in itself. The physical examination process was thorough and humiliating. Court officials inspected every aspect of the candidates' bodies, looking for skin infections, unwanted body hair, body odor, and physical deformities. For the Han Chinese women, their bound feet weren't seen as deformities, they were proof of their refinement and dedication to beauty. The smaller the foot, the higher the candidate ranked in desirability. Those who passed the initial screening faced weeks of additional training. They learned proper court etiquette, how to speak, walk, and gesture in ways appropriate for imperial concubines. For the Han Chinese women, this walking training was particularly challenging. They had to master the art of moving gracefully on their destroyed feet while wearing elaborate court robes and heavy headdresses. The successful candidates were then assigned ranks within the imperial harem hierarchy. The Qing system was highly structured: one empress at the top, followed by one imperial noble consort, two noble consorts, four consorts, and six concubines in the primary ranks, with unlimited numbers of noble ladies, first-class attendants, and second-class attendants filling out the lower tiers. But rank meant little when it came to the emperor's attention. With hundreds, sometimes thousands of women in the harem, most concubines lived their entire lives without ever speaking to the emperor, let alone sharing his bed. They existed in a strange limbo, pampered prisoners in the world's most luxurious cage, their bound feet ensuring they could never leave even if they wanted to. The daily reality of life for these women was a mixture of luxury and confinement that would drive modern people insane. They woke each day in beautiful chambers decorated with silk and precious stones, attended by armies of servants who catered to their every need. They wore the finest clothing, ate the most exquisite food, and had access to entertainment and education that most people could only dream of. Yet they were also completely cut off from the world outside the Forbidden City. They couldn't leave the northern section of the palace complex. They couldn't communicate with their families except through carefully monitored letters. They couldn't make choices about their daily activities, their clothing, their food, or even when they slept. Every aspect of their existence was controlled by court protocol and the whims of imperial officials. For the Han Chinese concubines with bound feet, this confinement was doubled. Not only were they trapped within the palace walls by imperial decree, they were trapped within the palace by their own physical limitations. A woman who could barely walk couldn't contemplate escape even if the opportunity arose. Their bound feet had made them perfectly suited for a life of pampered imprisonment. The psychological impact of this combination of luxury and helplessness was devastating. Many concubines developed what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. They turned to various coping mechanisms. Some threw themselves into artistic pursuits like painting and poetry. Others became obsessed with palace intrigue and gossip. Still others retreated into fantasy worlds or developed eating disorders. The competition among concubines was intense and often destructive. With so many women competing for the attention of one man, relationships between harem members were characterized by jealousy, suspicion, and occasional violence. The Han Chinese women with bound feet found themselves at both an advantage and disadvantage in this competition. Their feet marked them as refined and properly feminine by traditional Chinese standards, but also as physically weak and dependent compared to their Manchu counterparts. This creates the perfect setup for understanding what made the 19th century particularly brutal for these women, and why the intersection of imperial politics, cultural tradition, and female bodies created one of history's most complex systems of oppression. The 19th century marked the absolute peak of this twisted system, and the numbers tell a horrifying story. By 1850, the Qing Dynasty imperial harem contained nearly 800 women at any given time. Of these, roughly 60% were Han Chinese, meaning approximately 500 women hobbled through the Forbidden City on feet that had been systematically destroyed in childhood. That's 500 women who experienced daily pain just from walking to meals, who couldn't stand for more than minutes without agony, who required assistance for basic activities that any healthy person takes for granted. But the real horror wasn't just the physical limitations. It was how the imperial system weaponized these disabilities against the women themselves. The emperor's selection process for bedmates became a grotesque beauty pageant where bound feet were the ultimate prize, but also the ultimate trap. Court records from the Daoguang emperor's reign show that Han Chinese concubines with the smallest feet received preferential treatment, better quarters, and more frequent imperial visits. The message was clear: the more you had crippled yourself, the more valuable you became. This created a sick incentive structure that reached far beyond the palace walls. Families across China began binding their daughters' feet even more severely, hoping to catch imperial attention. Some girls had their feet compressed to just 2.5 inches, so small that walking became virtually impossible. These families were literally torturing their children more intensely in pursuit of imperial favor, creating a generation of women who were more disabled than any before them. The palace physicians kept detailed medical records that reveal the true cost of this system. Daily reports documented concubines fainting from pain, developing chronic infections in their feet, suffering from malnutrition because walking to meals was too agonizing. Some women developed what court doctors called foot madness, a condition where the constant pain drove them to episodes of screaming, self-harm, and complete psychological breakdown. Yet the imperial court treated these medical emergencies as minor inconveniences. When concubines collapsed from foot-related complications, they weren't given medical treatment to heal their feet. Instead, they received pain-numbing drugs and were expected to continue their duties. The attitude was clear: your suffering is the price of your beauty, and your beauty is your only value. The seasonal routines of the harem made everything worse. During winter, when temperatures in Beijing dropped below freezing, the bound feet of Han Chinese concubines became nearly useless. The poor circulation caused by tight binding meant their feet couldn't generate enough warmth to prevent frostbite. Many women spent entire months unable to walk at all, confined to heated chambers, while their Manchu counterparts continued their normal activities. Summer brought different torments. The binding cloths that held their deformed feet together became breeding grounds for bacteria and fungi in the humid Beijing heat. The smell became so overwhelming that imperial protocols required Han Chinese concubines to change their foot bindings twice daily during summer months. The process of unwrapping, cleaning, and rebinding feet that were essentially open wounds was excruciating. Yet it had to be done to prevent the infections from becoming life-threatening. Palace records describe how some concubines would bite through wooden sticks during these daily binding changes, their pain so intense that they couldn't remain conscious otherwise. Servants were assigned specifically to hold down women during foot care, because the agony often caused violent thrashing that could injure both the concubine and the attendants trying to help her. The emperor himself seemed oblivious to this suffering, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Court records from the Shanfeng emperor's reign describe elaborate foot viewing ceremonies where Han Chinese concubines were required to remove their shoes and display their bound feet for imperial inspection. The emperor would examine each woman's feet like a connoisseur, evaluating fine art, commenting on the arch, the point of the toes, the overall shape and size. These inspections were described by palace observers as deeply humiliating for the women involved. They were required to balance on their destroyed feet, while the emperor and his male courtiers discussed the aesthetic qualities of their deformities. Some concubines fainted during these sessions, unable to bear their own weight long enough for the inspection to conclude. Others wept openly, though this was considered a serious breach of protocol that could result in punishment. The punishment system within the harem was particularly cruel for women with bound feet. When concubines violated palace rules, one common penalty was forced standing for hours in the courtyard. For women with normal feet, this was uncomfortable but manageable. For women with bound feet, it was torture that could cause permanent damage to their already fragile bones and joints. Some concubines begged to be beaten instead of forced to stand, because physical violence would end quickly while standing punishment could last all day. The psychological warfare between Manchu and Han concubines reached its peak during the reign of the Tongzhi Emperor in the 1862. The Empress Dowager Cixi, herself a Manchu woman with natural feet, reportedly encouraged competition between the two groups as a way of maintaining control over the harem. She would publicly praise the grace and beauty of Han women's bound feet while simultaneously mocking their inability to participate in physical activities that Manchu women enjoyed. This created a toxic dynamic where Han Chinese concubines felt both superior and inferior simultaneously. They were told their bound feet made them more refined and feminine, yet they were excluded from horseback riding, garden walks, and other activities that required mobility. They lived in a constant state of cognitive dissonance, trying to take pride in a disability that limited every aspect of their lives. The servants assigned to care for these women developed their own hierarchies based on the type of feet they tended. Servants who cared for Manchu concubines had relatively easy jobs, helping with normal grooming and daily activities. Servants assigned to Han Chinese concubines faced daily exposure to infected wounds, overwhelming odors, and the constant emotional distress of women in chronic pain. Many servants requested transfers away from caring for bound-foot concubines, despite the higher pay these positions offered. The economic implications were staggering. Each Han Chinese concubine required approximately 3 times as many servants as a Manchu concubine, simply because basic tasks took so much longer and required so much assistance. The imperial treasury spent enormous sums on specialized shoes, medical supplies, sedan chairs, and pain medications, specifically for women whose feet had been deliberately destroyed. The empire was literally paying a fortune to maintain a system that crippled half its imperial women. Foreign observers who gained access to the palace during this period left detailed accounts that revealed just how normalized this suffering had become. British diplomat Robert Hart wrote in 1865 about watching palace servants carry grown women like children because walking was too painful for them. French missionary accounts describe concubines who hadn't walked more than a few steps in years, their leg muscles so atrophied from disuse that their limbs resembled those of invalids. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this system was how it shaped the women's own self-perception. Many Han Chinese concubines genuinely believed their bound feet made them superior to their Manchu counterparts. They had internalized the cultural message that pain and disability were prices worth paying for beauty and refinement. Some actively mocked Manchu women for having big, ugly feet, despite the fact that those natural feet allowed for normal, healthy lives. This psychological adaptation to trauma created women who defended the very system that had destroyed them. When Christian missionaries began speaking out against foot binding in the 1872, some of the most vocal opposition came from palace concubines themselves. They wrote letters and petitions arguing that bound feet were essential to Chinese culture, and that foreigners couldn't understand the beauty and sophistication that came from the practice. The medical knowledge of the time made everything worse because physicians understood just enough about circulation and infection to know that bound feet were causing serious health problems, but not enough to effectively treat them. Palace doctors prescribed treatments that often made the conditions worse, like applying heated metal to infected areas or using mercury-based compounds that caused additional poisoning. Women suffered not just from their original injuries, but from medical interventions that compounded their problems. As the 19th century progressed and China faced increasing pressure from Western powers, the bound feet of imperial concubines became a symbol of national weakness in the eyes of reformers. How could China compete with modern nations when half the women in the emperor's own palace couldn't even walk properly? This question would soon drive changes that these women never saw coming, changes that would challenge everything they had been taught about beauty, pain, and what it meant to be a woman in imperial China. The reform movements that emerged in the late 1800s created an impossible situation for these palace women. Christian missionaries had begun establishing schools and hospitals throughout China, and their reports about foot binding reached international audiences who were horrified by what they learned. Western newspapers published graphic descriptions of the practice, calling it barbaric torture masquerading as beauty culture. The international pressure was immense, but for the women already trapped in the system, these moral crusades offered no escape. Inside the Forbidden City, rumors of change created panic among the Han Chinese concubines. Their entire identity was built around their bound feet being valuable, desirable, the very reason they had been selected for imperial service. If foot binding was suddenly declared wrong or backward, what happened to women whose feet had already been destroyed? They couldn't unbind feet that had been shaped for decades. They couldn't grow back toes that had rotted away in childhood. They couldn't rebuild arches that had been snapped and folded in half. The Guangxu emperor, who reigned during the height of these reform pressures, found himself in an impossible position. Western diplomats constantly criticized China's treatment of women, pointing to foot binding as evidence of Chinese cruelty and backwardness. Yet his own palace was filled with women whose presence validated the very practice he was being asked to condemn. How could he declare foot-binding barbaric when his favorite concubines bore its marks? Palace records from this period reveal the psychological torture this created for the concubines themselves. Women who had spent decades taking pride in their 3-inch feet suddenly faced the possibility that they had suffered for nothing. Some developed what court physicians described as melancholia, spending days weeping inconsolably as they contemplated lives built around a practice the world now called torture. The emperor's solution was typically imperial in its cruelty. Rather than address the contradiction directly, he simply stopped selecting new Han Chinese concubines with bound feet while keeping the existing ones. This created a bizarre two-tier system where older concubines hobbled around on their deformed feet while newer additions walked normally. The message to the bound-foot women was clear: you're a relic of a shameful past that we'd prefer to forget. The isolation these women experienced became even more complete. They had always been physically trapped by their feet, but now they were culturally trapped as well. The very feature that had once made them desirable now marked them as symbols of national embarrassment. Younger palace women, both Manchu and the few Han Chinese who arrived with natural feet, looked at them with a mixture of pity and disgust. Some of the bound-foot concubines attempted desperate measures to regain relevance. Court records describe women trying to learn skills that didn't require walking, becoming experts in poetry, calligraphy, and music in hopes of attracting imperial attention through talent rather than physical beauty. Others threw themselves into palace intrigue, using their knowledge and connections to maintain influence despite their physical limitations. But perhaps most tragically, some began trying to unbind their feet. This process was even more agonizing than the original binding. Bones that had been broken and healed in twisted positions for decades couldn't simply be reshaped. Attempting to stretch feet that had been compressed for years caused excruciating pain and often led to new fractures and infections. Most women who tried this gave up within days, unable to bear the agony. The few who persisted through the unbinding process discovered that the damage was largely permanent. They might gain an inch or two in foot length, but the fundamental deformities remained. Their toes were still twisted or missing, their arches were still collapsed, their bones were still misshapen. They had endured months of additional torture for minimal improvement in function, and their feet now looked even more grotesque than before. The palace physicians were no help during this period. They had been trained to maintain bound feet, not to heal them. When concubines came seeking help with unbinding, the doctors had no effective treatments to offer. Some prescribed painful stretching exercises that caused more harm than good. Others suggested surgical procedures that were essentially experimental torture, cutting into feet that were already masses of scar tissue and broken bone. Meanwhile, the outside world was changing rapidly around these trapped women. The Natural Foot Society, founded by Christian missionaries and Chinese reformers, was gaining momentum throughout the empire. They organized public demonstrations where women with unbound feet walked, ran, and danced to show what natural movement looked like. These events drew huge crowds, but they were also devastating psychological blows to women whose feet had been destroyed in pursuit of beauty. The society published pamphlets describing the medical horrors of foot binding in graphic detail, complete with illustrations showing the bone deformities and tissue damage. These publications circulated throughout China, reaching even the servants and lower-ranking officials in the Forbidden City. Soon, everyone in the palace had seen detailed diagrams of exactly what had been done to the Han Chinese concubines' feet. This medical knowledge transformed how people looked at these women. Servants who had once admired the delicate beauty of bound feet now saw them as medical curiosities, evidence of systematic child abuse. The romantic mystique that had surrounded the practice evaporated when people understood the anatomical reality of what 3-inch feet actually meant in terms of broken bones and destroyed tissue. The concubines themselves began to understand their condition in medical rather than aesthetic terms. Palace libraries contained translated Western medical texts that described foot binding as a form of deliberate disability creation. Reading these clinical descriptions of their own bodies was devastating for women who had always thought of their feet as beautiful artifacts of feminine refinement. Some concubines stopped allowing their feet to be seen at all, keeping them constantly covered even during private bathing and medical examinations. The shame they felt was overwhelming, made worse by the fact that they couldn't hide or change what had been done to them. Unlike other forms of bodily modification that might be reversed or concealed, their foot binding was permanent and obvious every time they took a step. The emperor's own attitudes became increasingly conflicted during this period. Court records show that he continued to have sexual relationships with bound-foot concubines, but he also began making public statements supporting foot-binding reform. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on the women involved, who found themselves simultaneously desired privately and condemned publicly. The psychological pressure led some concubines to extreme measures. Palace records from the 1892nd document several suicide attempts among Han Chinese concubines, women who felt they had become living symbols of everything wrong with traditional Chinese culture. Some tried to poison themselves. Others attempted to hang themselves with the very silk-binding cloths that had shaped their feet. These suicide attempts created additional problems for palace administrators. How could they explain that women living in ultimate luxury were killing themselves? The official response was to increase surveillance and remove anything that could be used for self-harm, turning the harem into even more of a prison than it had been before. The international attention made everything worse for these women. Foreign journalists who gained access to the palace wrote sensational articles about the crippled concubines of the Chinese emperor. These stories, published in newspapers across Europe and America, described the women as pathetic victims of Oriental barbarism, stripping them of dignity and agency even as they criticized their treatment. Some concubines learned to read these foreign accounts through translators and were devastated by how they were portrayed. They had thought of themselves as refined ladies, but the Western press described them as mutilated freaks kept for the emperor's perverted pleasure. The cultural bridge they had tried to maintain between their traditional Chinese identity and the changing modern world collapsed entirely. The economic pressures of maintaining these women also became increasingly visible. Palace accountants calculated that caring for bound-foot concubines cost nearly 3 times what caring for natural-foot women required. These numbers became ammunition for reformers who argued that traditional practices were literally bankrupting the empire through inefficiency. Young Chinese intellectuals who supported modernization began using the imperial concubines as examples in their writings about national reform. They pointed out that while Chinese women were crippling themselves in pursuit of beauty, Western women were becoming doctors, teachers, and business owners. The bound feet of palace women became symbols of why China was falling behind the rest of the world. This political symbolism was incredibly painful for the women themselves, who had never asked to become representatives of anything larger than their own survival in a brutal system. They had bound their feet as children because that was what girls did to have any chance at a decent life. Now they were being blamed for China's problems by people who had never experienced the impossible choices these women had faced. As the 19th century drew to a close, it became clear that the system that had created these women was dying around them. The Qing Dynasty itself was weakening under pressure from foreign powers and internal rebellion. The imperial harem was shrinking, as fewer families were willing to send their daughters into a system that was increasingly seen as backward and shameful. For the bound-foot concubines still living in the palace, this meant watching their world disappear piece by piece. New women entering the harem had natural feet and modern educations. Palace protocols were changing to accommodate Western visitors who found traditional Chinese customs disturbing. The very foundations of the culture that had shaped these women's lives were crumbling beneath them, yet they remained trapped, physically and culturally unable to adapt to a world that was moving beyond them. Their bound feet had made them perfect for a system that no longer wanted to exist, leaving them as living relics of a practice that their own empire was preparing to abandon forever. The final decades of the 19th century brought an even crueler twist to these women's already impossible lives. As China faced military defeats at the hands of Western powers and Japan, the bound feet of imperial concubines became not just symbols of backwardness, but active propaganda weapons used against the dynasty itself. Revolutionary pamphlets circulated throughout Beijing, showing illustrations of hobbled palace women next to images of Western ladies riding bicycles and playing tennis. The message was unmistakable. How could China defend itself when even the emperor's women couldn't defend themselves? Inside the Forbidden City, this propaganda war created an atmosphere of barely concealed shame. Palace officials who had once celebrated the refined beauty of bound feet now avoided mentioning them entirely. Court ceremonies that had traditionally included foot-viewing rituals were quietly discontinued. The elaborate silk shoes that had been crafted specifically to showcase bound feet were replaced with plain coverings designed to hide rather than display. But for the women themselves, Hiding brought no relief from the daily reality of their condition. If anything, the secrecy made their suffering more isolating. They could no longer take pride in what had been done to them, but they couldn't escape it either. Every morning brought the same routine: unwrapping bandages from feet that would never heal, cleaning wounds that would never close, rewrapping their deformities in fresh silk that would be stained with blood and pus by evening. The younger generation of palace women, those who had arrived with natural feet, treated their bound-foot predecessors with a mixture of horror they thought no one was looking, trying, and fascination. They would stare when to understand how someone could walk on what appeared to be broken stumps wrapped in fabric. Some asked invasive questions about the binding process, treating the older women like living museum exhibits rather than human beings with feelings. These interactions were particularly painful because they highlighted just how much the world had changed. The natural foot women could run through palace gardens, climb stairs without assistance, stand for hours during court ceremonies. They took their mobility for granted in ways that would have been unimaginable to someone who had spent decades calculating every step to minimize pain. The medical establishment within the palace began treating bound feet as pathological conditions rather than aesthetic choices. Palace physicians started keeping detailed records of the various complications they observed: chronic infections that never fully healed, bone spurs that caused constant pain, circulation problems that led to tissue death. These clinical reports stripped away any remaining romantic notions about the practice. Some doctors proposed experimental treatments that promised to improve function, but these interventions were often worse than the original condition. One physician suggested breaking the bones again and resetting them in more natural positions. Another recommended surgical removal of dead tissue, essentially amputating parts of feet that had already been destroyed decades earlier. These procedures were performed without anesthesia on women who had no choice but to submit to whatever treatment was prescribed. The psychological impact of being treated as medical specimens was devastating. Women who had once been admired for their beauty now found themselves being examined like diseased animals. Palace physicians would invite colleagues to observe the bone deformities and tissue damage, discussing the cases in clinical terms, while the women lay exposed and humiliated on examination tables. Court records from this period reveal the growing desperation of bound-foot concubines as they realized their world was disappearing around them. Some began writing poetry about their condition, creating verses that expressed the pain they could never speak aloud. These poems described feet as lotuses that bloomed in blood and flowers that grew from broken stems, trying to find beauty in what the world now saw as mutilation. Others threw themselves into religious practices, spending hours in prayer and meditation as a way of coping with chronic pain and social rejection. Buddhist teachings about suffering resonated deeply with women who had experienced physical and emotional torment from childhood. Some became convinced that their pain was karmic punishment for sins committed in previous lives. The palace's architectural features, which had been designed around the assumption that women would have bound feet, now served as daily reminders of how thoroughly the world had changed. Stairs were built with risers too high for women on bound feet to climb safely. Pathways were too long for those who could only take tiny, shuffling steps. Gardens were designed with scenic viewpoints that required walking distances impossible for women who needed to rest every few yards. Palace administrators began making accommodations that highlighted the disabilities of bound-foot women even more starkly. Special sedan chairs were installed for transportation within the complex. Servants were assigned specifically to help with mobility. Rest areas were created at regular intervals along major pathways. These modifications were practical necessities, but they also marked the women as different, disabled, unable to function in spaces designed for normal human movement. The emotional toll of these accommodations was enormous. Women who had spent their lives trying to appear graceful and refined now found themselves dependent on assistance for basic activities. The independence they had never really possessed became even more obviously absent as the palace infrastructure adapted to their limitations. Foreign visitors to the court during this period left accounts that revealed just how bizarre the situation had become. European diplomats described watching palace ceremonies where some women walked normally while others were carried or supported by servants. The visual contrast was jarring and made the practice of foot binding appear even more grotesque to outside observers. These foreign accounts often focused on the economic waste represented by maintaining disabled women in luxury while the empire faced financial crisis. Critics pointed out that the resources spent on caring for bound-foot concubines could have been used for military modernization or infrastructure development. The women themselves became symbols of imperial decadence and misplaced priorities. The international attention also brought unwanted scrutiny to the daily routines of palace life. Journalists and diplomats asked detailed questions about how bound-foot women managed basic activities. Palace officials found themselves having to explain why grown women needed help with walking, why special furniture was required, why medical care was so expensive. These explanations invariably made the practice sound even more irrational and cruel. Some concubines became aware of this international criticism through palace gossip and translated newspaper articles. Learning that their condition was being discussed in foreign capitals was deeply humiliating for women who had been raised to value privacy and discretion above all else. They felt exposed and vulnerable in ways that went far beyond their physical limitations. The children of some concubines, who had grown up in the palace and witnessed their mother's struggles, began questioning the entire system. Young people who had never known a world where foot binding was universally accepted couldn't understand why anyone would choose to inflict such damage. Their questions forced the women to confront the possibility that they had suffered for nothing. These generational conflicts within the palace reflected broader changes happening throughout Chinese society. Traditional authority structures were breaking down as younger people embraced Western ideas about individual rights and bodily autonomy. The bound-foot concubines found themselves defending practices that their own children rejected as barbaric. The palace library began acquiring books and journals that discussed foot binding from medical and social perspectives. Some concubines learned to read these materials and were confronted with scientific explanations of what had been done to their bodies. Understanding the anatomical details of their condition was both enlightening and horrifying, giving them knowledge they had never possessed about their own physical reality. Reading accounts of the anti-foot binding movement was particularly difficult for these women. They learned about societies dedicated to ending the practice, about families who were raising daughters with natural feet, about women who had successfully unbound their feet as adults. This knowledge made their own situation seem even more tragic and permanent. The palace's isolation from the outside world, which had once protected these women from criticism and judgment, now felt more like imprisonment than privilege. They could see that the world was changing, but they couldn't participate in that change. Their bound feet had made them perfect prisoners in a system that was collapsing around them. As the 19th century ended and the 20th began, the bound-foot concubines of the Qing Dynasty found themselves living monuments to a dying culture. They had sacrificed their bodies for imperial favor that was increasingly worthless, beauty standards that were being abandoned, and social systems that were crumbling under pressure from both internal reform movements and external political forces. Their pain had become pointless, their disabilities meaningless, their entire existence a reminder of everything China was trying to leave behind. Yet they remained, hobbling through palace corridors that echoed with the footsteps of women who could walk normally, their bound feet clicking against stone floors in rhythm with a world that no longer moved at their pace. They were living proof of how completely a culture could fail the women it claimed to cherish, and their continued presence in the imperial palace served as a daily reminder of the price that had been paid for beauty standards that had never been beautiful at all. The revolution that would sweep away the Qing dynasty entirely was already gathering momentum beyond the palace walls, and when it came, it would leave these women as the last witnesses to one of history's most systematic campaigns of violence against the female body, carried out not by enemies or conquerors, but by families who believed they were giving their daughters the best possible chance at happiness and success. The story of these women doesn't end with the fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1912. Many of the bound-foot concubines lived well into the 20th century, becoming living reminders of a practice that modern China desperately wanted to forget. They watched as their own grandchildren grew up with natural feet, as women gained the right to education and careers, as the very concept of female beauty transformed beyond recognition. Yet they remained trapped in bodies that had been shaped by a culture that no longer existed. Think about that the next time you complain about beauty standards today. Yes, Social media creates impossible expectations. Yes, cosmetic procedures can be dangerous, but nothing in our modern world compares to a system that systematically destroyed children's bodies in pursuit of male approval. These concubines endured decades of daily agony so complete that walking to get food was a calculated risk, standing for a few minutes required planning, and running was simply impossible. Their suffering reveals something fundamental about how societies can normalize the most extreme forms of violence when they're wrapped in the language of tradition, beauty, and feminine virtue. The mothers who broke their daughters' bones weren't monsters, they were women trapped in a system that gave them impossible choices. The emperors who filled their harems with disabled women weren't uniquely evil, they were products of a culture that had convinced itself that female pain was beautiful. This is what happens when a society decides that women's bodies exist primarily for male consumption rather than female agency. The bound-foot concubines of the Qing Dynasty paid the ultimate price for that decision, spending their entire lives as living symbols of what happens when beauty becomes more important than basic human dignity. Their story isn't just history, it's a warning about what we're capable of when we forget that women are human beings first and everything else second.